There's a certain kind of silence that creeps in right after midnight. Not the peaceful kind, but the one that amplifies everything you've been trying to ignore. The unpaid bills, the unanswered messages, the weight of pretending everything is fine. You lie there in the dark, scrolling through your life like it's just another news feed. And even when nothing's wrong, something feels off. You have a job, maybe even a relationship, a roof over your head. So why do you feel like you're drowning inside your own mind? That's the question most people never dare to face. Because the world tells us that the problem is out there. Fix your job, fix your body, fix your relationship, fix your past. But the truth, you could fix everything and still feel empty. Because suffering doesn't begin out there. It begins in here. The battlefield isn't your office. It's not your bank account. It's not the person who left you or the world that misunderstood you. The real battlefield is your own mind. Most of us are at war every day and we don't even know it. We fight against our thoughts. We battle anxiety like it's a monster hiding under the bed. We chase happiness like it's a prize we'll unlock once everything aligns. But what if the war itself is the illusion? Imagine this. A person stands in the middle of a peaceful field. There's no threat, no enemy, no storm. But inside their head, 1,000 voices scream, "I'm not enough. They don't love me. I'll never be free." The field is calm, but they are in chaos. And that chaos colors the entire world. This is how most of us live, with a storm that never shows on the outside, but rages within every waking moment. And yet, we're taught to keep smiling. From the time we're children, we're trained to treat emotions like furniture. Arrange them neatly, keep them presentable, don't cry in public, don't show weakness. And whatever you do, don't let anyone know you're hurting, so we don't. We bury the pain beneath distractions. We scroll, we drink, we binge. We work harder, we love harder. We do anything not to face the silence within, but eventually the silence catches up. It always does. Buddhism doesn't ask you to run from that silence. It asks you to sit with it, to look into it without flinching. Because inside that silence is the only battlefield that matters, the one between awareness and attachment. The Buddha didn't teach that suffering comes from life being painful. He taught that suffering arises because the mind clings to what is temporary and rejects what it doesn't want to feel. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, a product of the mind's resistance. You don't suffer because someone criticized you. You suffer because a part of your mind believes you shouldn't be criticized. You don't suffer because something ended. You suffer because your mind wanted it to last forever. The war is not against the world. It's against reality. And every time the mind refuses to accept what is, it bleeds. But what if the struggle wasn't something to conquer, but something to understand? What if, instead of fighting your thoughts, you simply began to watch them? What if every anxious spiral, every wave of anger, every moment of sadness wasn't a problem to fix, but a messenger to listen to? That's the turning point. When you stop asking, "How do I get rid of this pain?" and begin asking, "What is this pain trying to show me?" There's a story in Zen about a man who dreams every night that he's drowning. In the dream, he thrashes and panics, trying to stay afloat. But no matter how hard he tries, the water pulls him under. One night he gives up. He lets go. And to his surprise, he floats. The mind is like that. The more we fight it, the more it fights back. But the moment we observe without resistance, something shifts. Suffering loses its grip. Not because the pain disappears, but because we stop identifying with it. That's the first great realization. The mind is not your enemy, but left untrained, it becomes your tormentor. It pulls you into stories of what if and what should have been. It tells you that happiness is one achievement away. It clings to praise and recoils from blame. It plays the same loops on repeat: fear, desire, comparison, regret. And yet the mind, when seen clearly, becomes a mirror, not of who you think you are, but of what you truly are beneath the noise. So the next time you feel overwhelmed, don't run, don't numb, don't distract, pause, take a breath, and listen. Ask yourself, what if this storm isn't the enemy? What if it's the gateway? Because the truth is, the greatest battle we will ever fight is not out there. It's the battle to see clearly, to wake up from the illusions we've built, and to finally understand. All suffering arises from the mind, but so does the end of suffering. And somewhere beneath all that noise, there's a stillness that has always been with you. Not in the future, not in some sacred temple, but in the space between thoughts, where the war ends and the journey inward begins. It always seems easier to point outward, to blame the world, the traffic, the economy, the weather, our parents, our past, our partners. If only they were different, if only this hadn't happened, then maybe we'd be at peace. We build entire identities around the belief that something outside us is responsible for the storm within. But what if that belief, that deeply embedded habit of blame, isn't truth, but a mirage? It starts early. A child spills their milk, and the first thing they say is, "The glass was too close to the edge." We're trained to deflect, trained to protect our sense of self, even if it means twisting reality just enough to feel safe. As we grow older, the stakes rise. A failed job becomes the fault of a bad boss. A breakup becomes the fault of a cold partner. Our anxiety becomes the fault of society or time or fate. But under every story, there's a quiet truth waiting to be seen. We blame the outside world because it hurts too much to face our own mind. Blame is a shield. It protects us from the discomfort of self-inquiry. It keeps our hands clean while pointing fingers. But what it never does is bring peace. Blame may feel empowering in the moment, but it quietly steals our freedom. Because if others are the source of our suffering, then we have no control, no way out, no power to change. The Buddha didn't teach us to blame. He didn't say, suffering arises because your boss is toxic. He didn't say, peace is found when the world aligns with your preferences. Instead, he pointed gently, unwaveringly back to the mind. In the second noble truth, the truth of the origin of suffering, he taught that suffering arises from craving, from attachment, from the way our mind clings to how things should be, instead of accepting how they are. This clinging, this insistence that the world should cater to our desires, is the birthplace of blame. Imagine standing at the shore of a restless ocean. The waves crash hard. Salt water sprays your face. It's cold, violent, loud. You shout into the wind, "Why are you doing this to me?" But the ocean doesn't hear you. It's not punishing you. It's just being what it is. The mind that blames is like the person yelling at the waves. It forgets that life has its own tides. It forgets that peace doesn't come from changing the waves, but from learning how to stand still as they rise and fall. When someone insults us, the blame begins. They disrespected me. They caused my pain. But look deeper. It's not the words that hurt. It's the meaning the mind attached. It's the part of us that believes the words, resists them, or fears they might be true. The insult is the match. The dry wood is already inside the mind. Without that wood, without ego, without attachment, the match would fall harmlessly to the ground. There's a moment in Buddhist meditation called seeing the spark. It's that instant before a full-blown emotion takes over. The very beginning of reaction. The flicker, the tightening of the chest, the shift in breath. And in that moment, if you're present enough, you realize something astonishing. You have a choice. You can let the emotion run wild, fuel the blame, spin the story. Or you can observe it, not suppress it, not fix it, just see it. And by seeing clearly, you stop being a victim of it. This isn't about denying injustice. There are real wounds, real betrayals, real pain caused by others. But the teaching here is subtle and powerful. The world may hurt you, but only your mind can keep you suffering. You are not responsible for what others do, but you are responsible for what you carry. And that responsibility, that willingness to look inward rather than point outward, is not weakness, it is strength, it is freedom. Take this in slowly. Blame is a prison disguised as protection. It keeps the pain outside, but also keeps healing out of reach. Forgiveness, not of others, but of reality, is the door that opens when blame finally dissolves. When you stop saying, "This shouldn't have happened," and begin saying, "This did happen. Now how do I meet it with wisdom?" A quiet shift begins to unfold. You return to your power, to the truth that was waiting beneath the noise all along. And maybe for the first time, you stop blaming the waves and start learning how to breathe under them. Not to escape suffering, but to see through its illusions. And just like that, the mirage begins to fade, revealing the next question. If the world isn't to blame, then what is? And as the dust of old stories settles, a deeper realization begins to surface. One that points not to the world around you, but to something much closer. When you begin to look inward, really look, you start to notice something uncomfortable. There's a hunger beneath your thoughts, a restless pull toward pleasure, comfort, control, and right beside it, a push, a constant resistance to anything that feels unpleasant, unfamiliar, or uncertain. And quietly lurking underneath both is a haze, a kind of not seeing, not blindness, but a refusal to look. Craving, aversion, ignorance. In Buddhist teachings, they are called the three poisons, because they infect the mind at its root. And from them, all suffering grows. The first is craving, T, a letter 1E47H, a macron in Pali. It doesn't just mean wanting something. It means being consumed by the desire for it. It means telling yourself, "I'll only be okay when I get this, when I reach that, when I feel this." But the moment you reach what you wanted, another craving appears, like a thirst that cannot be quenched. The perfect relationship, the perfect body, the perfect moment. You chase it, you catch it, and it slips through your fingers. Because craving doesn't end with satisfaction. It ends only when the craving mind dissolves. Then comes aversion, the shadow twin of craving. If craving says, "Bring me pleasure," aversion says, "Get this away from me." It's the recoil when pain shows up, the anger when someone disrespects you, the discomfort that turns into irritation, judgment, rage. But here, the trap. Pushing something away doesn't make it disappear. It just buries it deeper. And buried emotions don't die. They wait, they grow roots. They resurface in new forms: resentment, depression, numbness. Aversion turns pain into suffering, because now you're not just experiencing discomfort, you're fighting it. And then there's ignorance, the most subtle and the most dangerous. Ignorance isn't about lacking intelligence. It's about lacking clarity. It's the state of forgetting who we really are, of mistaking the impermanent for the permanent, of believing the self is solid, separate, unchanging. Ignorance says, "This is me, this is mine, this is how it has to be." It clings to illusions. It defends the ego. It keeps the mind trapped in loops that feel real, but are only shadows. These three poisons don't operate alone. Craving feeds aversion. You want something, you don't get it, now you're angry. Aversion feeds ignorance. You avoid discomfort, you never examine it, now you remain blind. Ignorance feeds craving. You forget your true nature, you feel incomplete, so you chase fulfillment in what can never satisfy. Round and round they spin, like a wheel that never stops, until awareness steps in and breaks the cycle. The Buddha didn't just name these poisons. He offered the antidotes. Where there is craving, cultivate contentment, not passivity, not laziness, but deep enoughness. A trust that this moment as it is can be met fully without needing to grasp or chase. Where there is aversion, bring compassion, not for what's easy to love, but especially for what's hard. The parts of yourself you've rejected, the people who trigger you, the pain that begs to be seen without being judged. And where there is ignorance, plant the seeds of wisdom, not from books alone, but from direct experience, from sitting with your own mind, watching it spin, watching it soften, watching it reveal the truth. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who sees. There's an old parable. A man is bitten by a snake. Instead of pulling out the venom, he chases the snake through the forest, blaming it, cursing it, trying to kill it. By the time he returns, it's too late. The poison has already spread. This is how we live, bitten by craving, aversion, ignorance. But instead of healing the wound, we chase the world in blame or desire, and all the while the poisons seep deeper, until we learn to stop, to turn inward, to extract the venom at its source. None of this is about perfection. You'll still crave, you'll still resist, you'll still forget. But now you'll start to notice. And noticing, truly noticing, is where transformation begins. Because when the mind is seen clearly, it begins to untangle itself. The poison loses its grip, the fire burns out, the clarity returns, and something miraculous starts to happen. You no longer chase every craving. You no longer flinch at every pain. You no longer live as a prisoner of the mind. You begin to walk with presence, with softness, with wisdom, and maybe, just maybe, you begin to taste a peace that no craving could ever give, no aversion could ever block, no ignorance could ever dim, a peace that was always there, hidden beneath the poisons, waiting to be remembered. There's a moment that almost always slips past unnoticed. It happens when someone criticizes you, and something inside tightens, not in your body but somewhere deeper. A sting, a flare, a surge of heat. The mind screams, "How dare they talk to me like that? Don't they know who I am? But who are you?" That question isn't asked often, because the mind doesn't want to look. It already believes it knows. I am this name, this face, this story, these memories. I am what I own, who I love, what I've achieved, what I've suffered. But what if all of that is just the surface? What if the self we cling to isn't real, but a story the mind keeps whispering, so it doesn't have to face the vast, beautiful truth of impermanence? The Buddha once said, "Where there is a self, there is suffering." That might sound harsh, even impossible, but look closely. Every wound you carry, every emotional scar, every disappointment can be traced back to a single thread. The belief in a solid separate me. You were insulted. It hurt because something inside said they attacked me. You lost something precious. The grief burns because you believed it was yours. You failed. Shame swells because it touches the idea of who you're supposed to be. Do you see it? The pain didn't come from the event, but from the identity that wrapped itself around it. That's the ego, a phantom wearing your name, a mask you forgot you were wearing. The ego doesn't like uncertainty, so it builds walls, it defines, it labels, it says, "This is who I am, this is who I'm not, this is my tribe, that is the enemy." And it clings to praise, to status, to roles, to control, because without those things it begins to dissolve. But here's the secret: the ego is not your enemy. It's just afraid. It's trying to protect something that never needed protecting. Your true nature, the one beyond name and form, was never broken to begin with. Think of the ego like a tight fist, always holding, always guarding, always tense. But open the hand, and suddenly there's nothing to defend. And in that openness, freedom returns. There's a story from the Zen tradition. A monk comes to his master and says, "I'm suffering, I can't find peace, please help me." The master replies, "Show me the self that is suffering, and I will set it free." The monk pauses, searches inward, and after a long silence says, "I can't find it." The master smiles, "Then I have already set it free." This isn't philosophy. It's not something to debate. It's something you can feel. In the exact moment, a thought arises that says, "They shouldn't have treated me this way. I should be better by now. I deserve more." Pause, ask yourself, who is speaking? Not from the surface, but from the still place behind the voice. You might begin to notice. There is no solid I there, only thoughts arising, only feelings passing, only patterns playing out in the space of awareness. And this is where everything changes. When you see the self not as a fixed identity, but as a process, a flow, a bundle of conditions constantly changing, you begin to loosen your grip. You begin to stop taking everything so personally. You stop needing to win every argument, prove your worth, guard your image. Because the ego may scream, but you are not the scream. You are the silence it echoes into. When we cling to ego, we suffer. When we loosen, we breathe. Relationships become softer, not because people change, but because you no longer need them to confirm your worth. Challenges become lighter, not because life gets easier, but because you stop dragging your identity into every experience. The world becomes less threatening, because you stop needing to protect a self-image. That was never truly you. This is not the loss of self. It is the return to your original nature. Before thought, before concept, before story. Call it awareness, call it presence, call it Buddha nature, it doesn't matter. What matters is you remember. You remember that what you are can't be insulted, abandoned, improved, or broken. It simply is. And once you've touched even a glimpse of that truth, you'll begin to notice how fragile the ego is. How hard it works to be seen, to be right, to be important. But you no longer need to feed it. You can bow to its efforts with compassion and let it rest, because the deeper you go, the more you realize you were never the character. You were the screen it played on. And with that, a new kind of peace enters, not from becoming more, but from becoming less entangled. It begins so subtly you don't even notice it. A memory, a voice, a fleeting sensation, then a thought arrives. I shouldn't have said that. They probably think I'm a failure. What if this never gets better? And just like that, the story begins, not the truth, not the moment, but a mental movie unfolding silently in the theater of your mind. And you are no longer the watcher, you're the character, trapped in a plot written by thoughts you didn't even choose. The mind is a storyteller. It loves narrative. It weaves meaning out of nothing. A glance becomes rejection. A delay becomes danger. A silence becomes proof that you're not enough. And once the story starts, it plays on loop, scene after scene, emotion after emotion, until you forget that it's only a story. You suffer, not because the event hurt you, but because your mind turned it into a tale of failure, betrayal, loss. Thoughts are not the enemy, they're not bad, but believing every thought without question, that's where the prison begins. The Buddha called this papanika, mental proliferation, the tendency of the mind to take a single thought and build an entire castle of suffering around it. A person doesn't text back. The mind says, "They're ignoring me. Then I must have done something wrong. Then no one really cares about me." Now you're not just sitting with a quiet phone. You're sitting in a story of abandonment. And it feels real because the mind told it convincingly. The ego loves these stories because each one reinforces identity. I'm the victim. I'm the hero. I'm the broken one who always gets left behind. But you're none of those things. You're the one who hears the story, not the one inside it. There's an ancient analogy. Thoughts are like clouds drifting through the sky. They come, they go, some are dark, some light, but none of them are the sky itself. The sky is your awareness, spacious, unchanging, untouched. But when you forget the sky, you start chasing the clouds. You think, this thought is me. This fear is true. This emotion means something is wrong. And now, you're no longer witnessing the weather. You're caught in the storm. Here's the truth no one tells us. A thought is just a thought. It's not reality. It's not prophecy. It's not even yours. Thoughts arise due to causes and conditions. Past experiences, fears, conditioning, memory, environment. They appear. They disappear. But suffering begins the moment we say, this thought means something about me. There's a powerful shift that happens when you learn to pause, when instead of reacting, you observe. A thought arises, I'm not good enough. And instead of spiraling, you notice it, you name it. A self-critical thought. That moment of naming is powerful. It creates space. Space between the thought and your sense of self. Space between reaction and awareness. And in that space, freedom is born. Mindfulness isn't about emptying the mind. It's about seeing clearly, watching the thought arise, like a ripple in water, and not diving in after it. You don't need to stop the mind from narrating. You just need to stop believing it so blindly. There's a story of a monk who sat in meditation for years, struggling. His thoughts raced constantly. He felt like a failure. One day, he asked his master, "Why won't my thoughts leave me alone?" The master smiled, "Let them come. Let them go. Just don't serve them tea." Not every thought deserves your attention. Not every inner voice is wise. The mind has been conditioned for decades. Don't expect it to become silent overnight. But with each moment of awareness, each time you catch yourself caught in a story, you reclaim your power. Because now you see the trick. Suffering isn't in the thought, it's in the identification. When you stop saying, "This is me," and start saying, "This is just something passing through," the mind begins to soften. The stories lose their grip, and what remains is silence, not empty, but vast, awake, free. So next time the storyteller starts again, reminding you of your flaws, replaying your past, predicting doom in your future, don't panic, don't fight, smile. You've seen this movie before, you know how it ends. And now, you can choose to step out of the script, because beneath the narration, beneath the noise, there is something far more real. You, the watcher, the witness, the awareness untouched by any thought, and in remembering that, you're no longer trapped. It's not the event that hurts, it's the reaction. It's not the words they said, but what your mind did with them. Twisting, judging, clinging, resisting, in a single second. Suffering is born, not from reality, but from resistance to reality. You spill your coffee, a small thing, but then the mind reacts, "I'm so stupid. Why does this always happen to me? This day is ruined." And now it's no longer a spill, it's a spiral. This is the moment the Buddha pointed to. The exact place where pain becomes dukkha, where sensation becomes suffering, not from the outside, but from the inside. We think suffering begins out there, in people, in events, in bad luck. But the real fire ignites when the mind contracts, when it says no to what is, when it clings to what it wants, or pushes away what it fears. In that tiny flash of reactivity, a whole world of suffering unfolds. A sound we didn't like, a look that felt wrong, a plan that didn't go our way. The outer event may last a second, but the mind keeps replaying it for hours, days, years. That is the hidden engine of human pain. Our constant reacting, resisting, reliving. The Buddha described this with startling clarity. He spoke of the two arrows. The first arrow is the unavoidable pain of life. Loss, illness, aging, death. No one escapes these. But the second arrow, That's self-inflicted. It's the reaction, the blame, the story, the grasping and rejection. The first arrow wounds the body. The second wounds the soul. And most of us are firing arrows at ourselves. Day after day, without even realizing it, someone disrespects us, and our mind screams, "How dare they?" We carry that moment like a stone in our chest, replaying it at night, telling our friends, fueling resentment, not because it happened, but because we reacted, and then clung to that reaction. This is how karma is born, not just through actions, but through habitual reactions. We react with anger and plant the seeds of more anger. We react with fear and live in a world shaped by fear. We react with clinging and suffer every time things change. Each reaction becomes a groove in the mind, a path we walk again and again, until it feels automatic, natural. But it's not nature, it's conditioning, and anything conditioned can be unlearned. So how do we break the cycle? How do we meet the moment without reacting? It starts with awareness, that tiny gap between stimulus and response. Before you lash out, before you run away, before the thoughts explode, there is a moment, a flicker, a breath, and in that breath, freedom lives. Mindfulness teaches us to see the spark before it becomes a wildfire, to notice, oh, anger is arising, or fear is starting to tighten. Not to suppress it, not to judge it, but to witness it calmly, kindly, and in doing so we transform it. As the Zen saying goes, feelings are visitors. Let them come and go, just don't offer them a bed. When you see your reactions clearly, they begin to lose their grip. You don't need to fix your anger, you only need to watch it, without feeding it, and soon it fades, like mist in morning light. This is how the mind unwinds, not through force, but through attention, not by suppressing reactions, but by not believing them so deeply. A monk once said, "Before enlightenment, I was angry 100 times a day. After enlightenment, maybe 95. That's the truth. This isn't about perfection, it's about presence. Not about never reacting, but about catching yourself sooner. Each time the mind begins to tighten, that's awakening, one pause at a time. Eventually, something beautiful happens. A moment that once triggered you passes like a cloud. An insult that once hurt you becomes just sound. A delay that once made you rage becomes a quiet opportunity to breathe. And in that moment, you realize something profound. The world hasn't changed, but you have. Suffering was never built into reality. It was built into your reactions. And now, you're learning to stop building. You're learning to let the moment be what it is. Raw, open, alive. And from this place, you can meet the world. Not with resistance, but with wisdom. Not with reactivity, but with spaciousness. Not with suffering, but with peace. There's a place inside you that has never been angry, never afraid, never craving, never clinging. It watches, it knows, it sees everything but reacts to nothing. This is the inner watcher. And the more you awaken it, the more suffering begins to lose its power. When a thought comes, it notices, a thought. When anger rises, it observes, anger is here. When fear whispers, it hears, fear is present. Not as you, but as a cloud passing through the sky of awareness. This is not detachment in the cold sense. This is freedom in the truest sense. You're no longer inside the storm. You're the sky it passes through. For most of our lives, we mistake the storm for the sky. A thought appears and we believe it. A feeling arises and we become it. A memory returns and we live it all over again. We are swept into the flood, drowning in reactivity, tossed by waves of craving, aversion, and confusion. But mindfulness throws us a rope, not to escape life, but to see it clearly. Mindfulness is not a technique, it's a return to the now, to the raw, unfiltered moment, to the simplicity of what is. Without the commentary, it's not about controlling the mind, it's about observing it, because only when you see it clearly can you be free from its traps. The Buddha called this sati, a sacred awareness that remembers to return to the breath, return to the body, return to the experience before the story begins. And in this space of attention, miracles unfold, pain becomes sensation, fear becomes energy, anger becomes heat moving through the body, without the label, without the drama, without you clinging to it. Just life. As it is, think of your mind like a stage. Thoughts, emotions, memories, they all perform. But mindfulness is the audience, calm, present, aware. And when the watcher wakes up, the performers lose their grip because they no longer control the show. So how do we cultivate this inner watcher? We begin small, simple, one breath, one step, one mindful moment. You drink your tea fully aware. You feel your feet touch the ground fully alive. You listen not to reply but to truly hear. And suddenly your life becomes practice. The mundane becomes sacred. The noise of the world begins to quiet. In mindfulness, we stop fighting experience. We stop saying this shouldn't be here. We learn to sit with discomfort, to breathe through tension, to witness confusion without rushing to fix it. And something extraordinary happens. When you stop running from pain, pain loses interest in chasing you. When you stop clinging to joy, joy becomes more gentle, more real. Because now you're not trying to hold life. You're letting life hold you. The inner watcher isn't distant, it's deeply intimate. It's you before the name, before the story, before the roles. It doesn't judge your fear, it sees it. It doesn't argue with anger, it honors it. It doesn't grasp for peace. It becomes peace through presence. This is why mindfulness is not a fix. It's a doorway to the truth that suffering is not in the moment, but in the resistance to the moment. And when we bring awareness to the resistance, the grip starts to loosen. The thoughts slow down, the emotions soften, the body relaxes, and the silence that has always been there begins to rise to the surface. Even in chaos, the watcher remains still. Even in grief, the watcher sees clearly, and in that stillness, you find what no achievement, no relationship, no possession can give: liberation, not from life, but into life as it truly is. The Buddha didn't promise that mindfulness would erase all pain. He promised that it would liberate you from unnecessary suffering. He didn't say life would be easy. He said awareness would make it bearable, meaningful, even beautiful. Because when you're present, even the simplest moment can reveal the sacred. A bird sings. You truly hear it, not as background noise, but as a gift. The sun warms your skin, and suddenly it's enough. You look into someone's eyes and see not a role or a label, but a living being just like you, trying to be free. This is the fruit of mindfulness, not perfection, but presence. Not escape, but embrace. And the more you live from this space, the more the chains fall away. Not all at once, but breath by breath, moment by moment, layer by layer, until one day you look back and realize you were never trapped, only asleep, and now you are waking up. What if freedom had nothing to do with where you are, and everything to do with how you see? What if liberation wasn't a distant goal, but a shift here now inside? What if the end of suffering isn't out there in the world, but waiting quietly within your own mind? We spend our lives trying to fix the external: more money, more security, more love, less chaos. We think, if only things were different, I'd finally be at peace. But things change, people change, bodies age, life surprises, and peace, if based on conditions, disappears as fast as it arrives. The Buddha saw this, saw the chasing, saw the clinging, saw the never-ending hunger for more. And he offered a truth both radical and liberating. Suffering ends not by changing the world, but by transforming the mind. It sounds simple, but it's not easy. Because the mind is slippery. It tells stories. It spins illusions. It blames, defends, avoids, and reacts. It convinces us that happiness is out there, and that we must control everything to feel safe inside. But control is a prison. And the tighter you grip, the more suffering you create. So where does real freedom lie? In non-reactivity, in letting go of the fight, in seeing clearly without resistance, without judgment. You can't stop thoughts from arising, but you don't have to believe them. You can't prevent emotions from moving through you, but you don't have to become them. Freedom begins when you stop fusing your identity with every feeling, thought, and desire that appears. The Buddha called this vimutti, inner release, not a shutdown of emotions, not spiritual bypass, but the deep realization that I am not my anger, I am not my fear, I am not my craving. They come, they go. They are weather patterns in the sky of mind, but the sky remains untouched. Imagine someone insults you. In the old mind, the ego fires up. How dare they? But in the free mind, something else arises, a breath, a pause, a space wide enough to hold the anger. Without becoming it, you see it for what it is, a spark, a wave, not a command. And in that moment, you are no longer a prisoner. You are free. This is the essence of the Buddha's path, not a denial of suffering, but a transcendence of its grip. He didn't promise a life without pain. He promised a mind no longer enslaved by it. And that's the revolution. Pain may still come, but the suffering, the mental bondage, the resistance, the craving that can end. So what does a free mind look like? It responds but does not react. It feels deeply but clings to nothing. It lives fully but without attachment. It knows joy but doesn't chase it. It knows sorrow but doesn't drown in it. It sees thoughts but doesn't worship them. It sees the self but knows it's not fixed. It lives in the world, but is no longer trapped by it. And the best part, this freedom is not for monks alone, not for saints or sages in distant caves. It's available to you, right now. You don't need to escape your life. You need to wake up within it, to meet each moment with awareness, to greet each thought with spaciousness, to walk through each challenge with compassion and clarity, because every moment is a choice, cling or release, react or respond, sleep or wake up. And as you choose awareness again and again, you begin to feel the chains loosen, not all at once, but gradually, softly, until one day in the middle of ordinary life, you notice something extraordinary. You're not suffering the way you used to. You're lighter, calmer, clearer, because now you see. The end of suffering is not the end of life's messiness. It's the end of mind-made misery. It's the end of the fight against what is, and the beginning of deep, grounded peace. Even in the middle of the storm, the Buddha's gift was not just philosophy. It was a map, a path out of suffering, and every breath you take in mindfulness, every moment you meet with clarity, every craving you witness rather than obey, is a step closer to that freedom. Not in the future, but now, because the mind is not your enemy, it's a powerful tool. When awakened, and when you stop identifying with its noise, you discover the silence that was always there. A silence not empty, but full of truth, and in that silence, suffering dissolves, and the real you, the spacious, boundless, luminous you, rises. Awakening isn't just a mountaintop experience. It's not thunder, lightning, or some cosmic light show. It's a quiet shift, a subtle clarity, a moment when you finally see, and can't unsee. But here's the real question. What happens after the seeing? Because even after you realize the source of suffering is your own mind, even after you taste that deep, inner silence, life still calls, the kids still fight, the bills still pile, the the traffic still waits. So how do you carry the awakened mind into a world that seems built to distract, irritate, and overwhelm? The answer is simple, though never easy. Live from the wisdom moment by moment, not just during meditation, not just in silence, but in the noisy, messy, unpredictable theater of daily life. Wisdom is not what you know, it's how you move. It's how you speak when you're tired, how you listen when you're annoyed, how you breathe when you're anxious, how you pause when the old mind wants to react. Imagine this: you wake up late, you spill your coffee, your partner snaps at you, the kids won't stop yelling, the old mind tightens. Why is this happening to me? But the awakened mind notices. Here's a wave of frustration. Can I breathe with it? Instead of reacting blindly, you respond with clarity. You don't suppress the feeling, you witness it, hold space for it. Let it rise and fall like a passing cloud. And just like that, the moment becomes sacred, not because it's perfect, but because you showed up fully for it. This is the real power of the awakened mind. Not to escape life, but to meet it with full presence, to bring the monastery into the marketplace, to turn the kitchen, the traffic jam, the office, into your meditation cushion. Because every situation, especially the uncomfortable ones, is your training ground. In Buddhist tradition, this is called bringing the practice into life. Not hiding from difficulty, but bowing to it as your teacher. Every person becomes a mirror, every challenge a lesson, every irritation a bell of mindfulness. Take anger, for example. It's not the enemy, it's a flare, a signal, a doorway. When it arises, the awakened mind doesn't say, "I shouldn't feel this." Instead, it whispers, "Let me see this clearly. What's beneath the fire?" And often beneath anger is hurt, fear, a longing to be seen or loved. To live from wisdom means to meet the anger with compassion. Instead of projecting it onto others or take craving, the mind says, "I need that new thing, that person, that escape." But the awakened one sees through it, not by forcefully denying it, but by gently inhaling awareness into the desire, asking, "Will this actually satisfy me, or is this just another loop?" Often, that question alone is enough to cut the chain. This is how suffering ends, not with grand declarations, but with small, quiet shifts in how you relate to your inner world, one breath at a time, one pause at a time, one clear seeing at a time. And when the awakened mind begins to lead, your life becomes a reflection of that clarity. You speak less but with more truth. You do less but with more presence. You seek less but feel more whole. People may notice it in you, not as something flashy or loud, but as a stillness in your gaze, a gentleness in your tone, a calm that doesn't cling to outcomes. That's the fragrance of awakening. But even the awakened mind must be tended to. Like a garden, it needs water. Like a fire, it needs fuel, which means you keep returning to practice. You keep coming back to stillness. You keep showing up, especially when it's hard. Because life will test you. Old patterns will visit again. Pain will knock at your door. But now you greet them as old friends, not enemies. You say, "I see you. Come in, teach me." And in that soft, open welcome, suffering loses its grip. That's the paradox. The more awake you become, the more human you feel, not less emotional, but more able to hold those emotions without drowning in them. Not detached from life, but more rooted in its richness, its texture, its beauty. Awakening is not about rising above life. It's about falling fully into it, with eyes wide open. And when you live that way, consciously, deliberately, compassionately, you become medicine to a world still caught in reaction. Your presence heals, your calm steadies, your silence teaches louder than words, not by preaching, but by being. This is how the awakened mind moves through the world, like still water, clear, deep, reflective. like open sky, vast, ungraspable, free. And in every step, every breath, every glance, you plant seeds of present, seeds of peace, seeds of freedom. The journey doesn't end with seeing, it begins with living. And when wisdom becomes your way of being, suffering becomes your greatest teacher, and life itself becomes the path. It began quietly, with a whisper inside your own mind, a subtle ache, a question you couldn't quite shake: why am I still suffering? You may not have had the words for it back then, but something in you knew. The problem wasn't out there. It was in here, so you looked at your reactions, your cravings, your fears, your thoughts that never stopped spinning, and what you found wasn't always pretty. There were shadows, old wounds, stories on repeat, but there was also a flicker of light, a silence beneath the noise, a stillness that didn't need fixing, only remembering. And now here you are, not at the end, but at the beginning again, full circle, because all along this journey wasn't about reaching some faraway enlightenment. It was about returning to what was always here, the mind, not the chaotic one, but the spacious one, the one that sees without clinging, the one that feels without drowning, the one that is before thought, before identity, before fear. This is coming home, not to a new belief, not to a perfect version of yourself, but to the awareness that never left, the silent watcher behind the storm, the eye of the hurricane, the clear mirror reflecting it all yet untouched by any of it. The Buddha didn't point to heaven, he pointed to the mind. He didn't offer escape, he offered understanding, because suffering was never the enemy, it was the messenger, a knock on the door, a call to wake up. And when you finally answered that call, you didn't transcend life. You fell deeper into it, fully, present, alive. All suffering arises from the mind, but so does peace, so does compassion, so does wisdom. You are not your anger, not your cravings, not even your thoughts. You are the space that holds them all, with tenderness, with curiosity, with profound freedom. So what now? Now you live, you love, you stumble, you learn. You meditate not to escape the world, but to meet it more clearly. You breathe not to fix yourself, but to remember what's real. You sit in silence not to become special, but to remember how ordinary, how sacred every moment is. And when suffering visits again, as it will, you no longer run, you welcome it, you listen, you ask, what are you here to show me? Because you've learned every wave passes, every thought fades, and beyond all of it, there's the vast, unshaken awareness that you are. Coming home to the mind isn't about arrival, it's about return. Return to the place before the story, before the roles, before the chasing. A place where nothing needs to be added, and nothing can be taken away. Pure, open, free. In this home there are no locks, no walls, no maps, only stillness, only presence, only now. And in this now, you find peace, not the kind that depends on circumstance, but the kind that was here all along, waiting for you to notice. So yes, the journey ends here, but more truthfully, the journey ends nowhere, because awakening isn't a destination. It's how you walk, and now you walk with clarity, with compassion, with the quiet knowing that no matter where life takes you, you're already home.